First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land which this event is taking place on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, people past, present and emerging, and recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded. I'd also, I guess, like to just say that the content of this panel, some of it might be a bit triggering with some of the themes that we're going to be talking about. If anyone feels as if they need to leave the theatre, by all means, take some of the space outside. The bathrooms tonight are also in keeping with the evening, more than bathrooms, they're just located outside the lift here, and there's some around the way just next to the lecture theatre to our right, and they're all not signed with anything to do with gender, so they're all about amenity, so we'll see how we go. My name is Simona Castricum. I'm at the University of Melbourne in Melbourne School of Design. And I'd like to welcome you to Melbourne Design Week, More Than Bathrooms, Gender Diversity in Architecture. Really happy to get the support of the Melbourne School of Design for this, who are behind it. And also there's some hashtags and there's some @ symbols and stuff, so if anyone gets a signal down here, because it's a bit of a bunker, you can tweet some stuff. You can start the conversation rather than join it. I'll now introduce a really awesome panel that I was really happy. Everyone I invited said yes. It wasn't one of those things where it was like people were saying no. Andrew Eklund, just here, is the Executive Director of Transgender Victoria, an organisation dedicated to achieving equity in the lives of trans and gender diverse people through advocacy and education. His two passions are peer support and caring for our trans and gender diverse people in prison. Andrew is a man assigned female on his birth certificate. He is a mother to his 25-year-old son and owns a laundry in Geelong.
Almost all of that's old news since we wrote it. I sold the laundry.
You sold the laundry?
I sold the laundry last week.
Well, I'm excited to hear what beckons next from the laundry. And Andrew believes trans people are awesome and can offer a unique insight into gender assumptions governing our world. Next we have Dr. Bianca Fileborn on the end over there, who's a lecturer in Criminology at the University of Melbourne at the School of Social and Political Sciences. Bianca is also currently an ARC Discovery Early Career Research Award Fellow. Her research is concerned with examining the relationships between space, place, identity, culture, and sexual violence, and justice responses to sexual violence. Bianca is the author of Reclaiming the Nighttime Economy, Unwanted Sexual Attention in Pubs and Clubs. I've read it, it's great, you should all do yourself a favour. There you go, selling the merch. And co-editor of Me Too and the Politics of Social Change. We also have Sally Goldner, AM, co-founder, Transgender Victoria, and a broadcaster of 3CR's Out of the Pan. Sally's 20-year involvement in Victoria's LGBTIQ communities includes Transgender Victoria, co-facilitating Trans Family, presenting 3CR's Out of the Pan, and as a Bisexual Alliance Victoria Treasurer. She was awarded an Order of Australia in 2019, is a life member of 4 organisations, the 2015 LGBTI Victorian of the Year, and joined the Victorian Women's Honour Roll in 2016. And next to me, SJ Norman, artist producer in residence for Next Wave. Working under the birth name of SJ, Sarah Jane Norman, Onyx B Carmine's career as an interdisciplinary artist and writer has spanned 13 years, with a long duration process-based and endurance practices, as well as intimate one-to-one frameworks. They have sought through much of their work to implicate the body of the audience and the body of the performer as co-agents of magical acts in order to explore hybrid languages of ritual and queer decolonial knowledge-making. A diasporic Koori with ancestral and family ties to the Wiradjuri, the Woonera and the Yampa lands, Onyx was born on unceded Gadigal country. They have lived and worked in many places, most recently Berlin, where they were based for 9 years, relocating to Wurundjeri country in 2017. Peter Waples-Crowe in the middle. Artist, Indigenous health educator for Thorne Harbour Health. Peter is a Nagaru queer, visual and performing artist and Aboriginal health worker whose artwork has featured in many spaces through Victoria. His art practice is at the intersection of his experiences as an Aboriginal queer man and his work with community health and community arts organisation as such. The Torch, the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, and his current role at Thorne Harbour, formerly the Victorian AIDS Council. Peter is currently the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peer engagement worker for the VAC. Could you make everyone very welcome? So I wanted to convene a panel or an event for Melbourne Design Week that sort of subverted the design symposium. I wanted to put the stakeholders on the stage, and I wanted to put the designers in the audience. Not because I'm trying to be a smartass, but because I'm sort of quite desperate, I think, to reframe, I guess, the conversation around gender diverse experiences and inclusion in architecture. And I want people with lived experience to be centred in that conversation. And I also want allies as well to become part of the conversation, because often it's a conversation that's sort of imposed upon us for kind of reasons that we sort of rather not be sort of directed to, if you like. So, because more than bathrooms is really, of course we do more than go to the bathroom, trans people, you know. I mean, that's quite the obvious thing. But as designers, I think people kind of think about, okay, well, what sector do I work in? Oh, I work in the public, you know, I work in public health, or I work in airports, or I do universities or theatres, or, you know, I work in, you know, I design prisons, for instance. And it's, I want people to think a little bit harder about not only that those spaces are gendered, but those spaces have very different experiences for people who are gender diverse. So I really just want people to reframe the way that they approach those buildings and the way they understand those spaces, but also the way that people understand the briefing process, the procurement process that goes on, and the way that we bring these spaces about. But I also want the people who are talking today I guess I want better relationships between designers and stakeholders. So there's this quote that I put in an article with The Guardian that regrettably the public bathroom has become a battleground for transgender rights. A discussion that is largely imposed upon the trans and gender diverse community by cisgender interest groups. The trans bathroom panic phenomenon remains a distraction not only from our rights to piss without prejudice, but from much larger issues worthy of discussion like pathways to identification, healthcare, employment, housing, security and public safety. Now, all of these things have, you know, a big influence on architectural space, but also on participation. And I think this slide is quite compelling. this is a study that I've been using for my PhD in gender non-conforming experiences of architectural space. 38.8% of trans people in this study reported avoiding public restrooms. 38.4% avoided using gymnasiums. 29.8% reported avoiding clothing shops. Thank goodness for online shopping. I hope it fits. And 24% reported avoiding going to using public transportation. But the interesting thing that is pointed out is, you know, how can we effectively address areas perceived unsafe, or how can we change participation of gender non-conforming people and the quality of that? Like, what are some of the emotional things that people go through? So how might architects kind of end the stigma and become part of it in practice? So, Sally, I wanted to start by using a quote from a professional wrestler that you put me in. I think it's a really good quote, because buildings are kind of programmed to do a certain thing, but they don't always function that way, and nor do they sort of recognise people for who they really are. If you ever feel like a square peg trying to fit into a round hole, if you ever feel like you don't fit the mould, that is because you weren't meant to, that is because you weren't meant to. You are meant for greater things. Don't try to be something you aren't. Embrace what makes you different and be accepting of what makes others different, because that is how dreams become reality.
Thanks. And do apologise in advance, slight lurgy that I'm fighting, but hopefully winning. So apologise for any coughs or croaks. Yeah, what a good quote. And, well, it also makes sure that I get in right at the start my obligatory WWE reference. 19 days till WrestleMania. But I think Beth Phoenix, for those who don't know, is a taller, more muscular woman. You know, wasn't the square peg in the round hole. And I suppose it brings up a concept of question the question. Why do we do things in certain ways? Why do we have such rigid gender definitions? And one of the topics we put up there was swimming, which is of great interest to me as someone who's finally got back into exercise. And the concept that when we were having a think about was our own personal stories. When I had the unfortunate experience of spending all 13 years at an all-boys school, there was an expectation that you would do sport in a certain gendered way because I was assigned male at birth. And really a body is a body, and how it functions is how it functions. And, you know, I've noticed the glasses, that's because I have a turn in my left eye. My right eye, if I'm just turning relatively, directly to the audience, sure, that's going there, left eye's off that way. So not good for sport and recreation because so much is built on reflex. And similarly, football, I have one leg shorter than the other, so I wasn't good at dodging tackles. And so as much as I think it's great that we have the AFLW, and I did go to a match a few weeks ago, and it was the best thing ever. Did I bump into you there, actually? Yeah, yes, we did.
Yeah, we did.
And it was a great queer-friendly space too.
Yeah, the wing of Victoria Park's never been so queer.
That's right.
I mean, it's a revolution.
Well, and I'm going, well, I will honour... Where are we? 25 years on after what Nicky Winmar did on the wing of Victoria Park. We've got some diversity, even if it's not everything we want, and I'll leave that to Peter. But seriously, I think it says how much we put gendered expectations on people that they have to do things a certain way, and we don't, have a sense of flexibility and inclusivity that covers the individual. And having taken up swimming, well, who cares if one leg's shorter than the other, which is why I couldn't dodge tackles at football, because you're vertical. Doesn't make a difference. And so when we talk about space, it's not just the physical and the tangible. It's how do we create spaces that have a sense of holisticness and feel. And one of the other words we put up there was airports. And, the issues that trans people face in airports with the dreaded body scanner things and security in general. And one time at a domestic flight, just after I went to the bomb type of scanner thing, so after the first one, I I got misgendered and I did the right thing. And then just as I'm walking off afterwards, I hear these two security people burst out laughing. How dare I question them? So spaces, it does cover a whole concept of things. So what I'm aiming to do here is really open this up. Space, yes, is physical. We're in a room, but what's the feel? What's the abstract? Or as that great philosopher from the castle, Dennis Denuto, would say, the vibe, Your Honour. How can it feel safer for more people, including on a gendered basis, and feel more acceptable, just so we can be positive, in that sense for gender for all people. So there's some, just sort of openers, some teasers from me.
And just on the point of safety, like we're talking about, let's make safe, safe, nice and make space, nice and safe. What about risk and the right to take risks, the right to walk at night and to do something that's,
Well, the streets, absolutely, cannot be safe for lots of people in relation to gender. So how do we make those spaces? Is it, yes, have architecture that has better lighting, but what about prevention? It's obviously got to be an issue where anyone should be able to walk down the street any time and feel safe. So yes, there's a space issue, but is it lighting? Is it having, it would be great if we could naturally prevent all violence of any sort. But how do we make spaces, if there is a problem, where you can just duck in somewhere and just have that sense of safety? What sort of things can we do? Is putting signs up, safe space, that sort of thing is really important. So, yeah, it is a whole concept. It is a holistic thing, and there's all sorts of, angles of diversity, variations that need to be thought about, and, questioning the question. Yeah.
At this point, I might just if there's anyone in the audience who is deaf, and we've got some interpreters in, just let us know. Otherwise, if there's no one here, then might take a break. But yeah, just let yourself known. With that, buildings have an archive of memory. Buildings have not only do they have an archive of memory, but they also kind of reinforce gender norms as well. So this was a quote that I pulled out from a paper called Breaking Ground on a Theory of Transgender Architecture. Buildings not only house actual archives, but are themselves archival in their materialisation of, for instance, gender norms. Subtle gendered norms of buildings that are consolidated through thousands of years' worth of architectural tradition and memory. Likewise, such single-sex spaces imprint the body as transgender and concurrently discipline it as such. Andrew, we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and you were talking about some of your experiences. What can you say to this?
Yeah, it's interesting to know sort of where to begin, but like when you just read that quote, buildings like the Women's Hospital, the Royal Women's come to mind, and as a trans man who might need services at the Royal Women's, because I have those internal organs, that in itself is an interesting thing. But a building that's new and not meant to be gendered is an interesting one for me. The new Peter Mac building. Now you look at spaces and you think, what are they built for? Why are they built a certain way? And the big foyers, the big grand empty foyer with the tiles and all the way in, I sort of refer to it, I've referred to it before as the walk of shame. Like they were invented. They came into existence in the old forts, where if you were meant to be intimidated as you went to the ruler of the place and by the grandeur of the great big thing. And I'm not quite sure why they've put that in that foyer. It's not only in the foyer, it goes all the way up the entire building with this kind of thing that's meant to be so grand. Imagine it. You're a trans woman trying to walk through, trying to be discreet in the hills, click, 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 trying not to be seen as you walk through for safety reasons and for morale reasons. It's absolutely terrible. But if you think of it from a trans and gender diverse person, that's one side. What about just being a chemo patient who's lost your hair and doesn't feel really hot about how they're looking and all that? That's what you've got to walk through? Why did they choose the intimidating grand entrance that's meant to intimidate people for a building that's meant to welcome and be safe and like a home and nurturing? So I ask you to think about, what is the building for? What is the purpose? Like you say, airports and screening, that is security, that is meant to be intimidating again. So if you're in an intimidating space or an intimidating historical architecture, magnify that 100-fold for trans and gender diverse people. That's how we're going to experience it, and probably run for the hills. So if it's a space where we need to go and are probably best to stay, like a healthcare space, maybe make it more homely. And the other one that comes to mind in that sense that we didn't talk about on the phone was the White House in America. The White House was the opposite of now we do see the facade and we sometimes think of it as a grand building, but actually inside there are no big intimidating spaces. And one of the reasons for that was that the president, when it was built, was not meant to think of himself above the people, but be continually reminded that he was part of the people. So often in the spaces inside there, they're all very differently, the furnishings, whether there's wallpaper or not, these sort of things are used to make a building more homely and more soft, and can sometimes make a place feel more safe and more inclusive. Now, there's many more things that we talked about, but maybe we can circle back, because I don't want to just
the hospital.
hog the mic all over. But
But you were talking about sort of, the way that, particularly like, there was one of the floors.
There's an
that
entire
was very
floor
gendered.
there. Yeah, there's an entire floor in Peter Mac that's for women only. It's women's business, as I call it, and I don't mean that with any disrespect. Don't want to misappropriate culture on the floor. But as a trans man, I have spent 44 years being perceived by the world as female. I know what it feels like to walk through a world female, and I'm not taking anything away from women that they need spaces to and need to be in the culture, but that building feels so female. The guys sit in the screening area for, where you go for your tests and things, level 5, if you've been there, and nod at each other at how they do not feel like the building's really for them. It's quite incredible how gendered it is when it's not really meant to be a gendered building. And that's taking it right outside just trans and gender diverse experience into just gendered building. So it's a really interesting thing to think about what you're building for, and how are you creating the images that make people feel at home. And yes, sometimes we can get so caught up on making the minority, any given minority feel comfortable, that we actually alienate another whole set of the population.
But sometimes, I think that kind of highlights the idea that sometimes if you work back from, say, experiences, say for instance of gender non-conforming experiences, for instance, you might actually solve some problems for the larger community.
Well, that's why I say in my bio that I really think we have so much to add, actually, to the conversations and to the design spaces and to all kinds of educational settings. And the things you get to experience once you've crossed that gender line in life, sometimes it makes us more touchy, but sometimes it makes us more open to realise the differences. I've had a good mate, so I've spent so much time in this cancer realm, and trans man as well, and he's sitting there getting the chemotherapy, the R-CHOP, and all the seats all sit looking at each other in the chemo lounge. And all the women get off at these ice packs, because women would hate to lose their hair so much, wouldn't they? And so they need help. Yes, that's lovely. What about the trans man losing his beard? He's sitting there feeling sick, not from the chemo, but from the emotional side of loss of that hair that is so important, and not a word for it. Nowhere to go for it. No guy ever gets taken down to the wig unit. Like, it's not even visible anymore. In the old Peter Mac, everyone used to walk past it. In the new one, it's on the women's floor. Mm. It's like, really?
Yeah.
So it's all those little things. And one thing they do really well, because I sound like I'm bagging Peter Mac, I'm not at all. They've just a wonderful hospital, but I'm just talking architecture at the minute. The signage, they've got a room there for families or loved ones of people, so you can get a cup of tea and not have to pay for it at the coffee, because you at the coffee cafe, because you're there so much. They've called it the familial room. That was so good. It used to be the family lounge, and I knew I wasn't really meant to be there. The familial room, I'm absolutely certain that they've got Indigenous people in mind when they've written that. But as an LGBTI person, with my family being not my biological family, that was so inclusive for me. So little things make big differences to us.
No, that's really good. And I think it speaks to like how we, like it's the whole, it is the vibe, Sally. It's totally the vibe. It's how we manage buildings, it's how we program them, it's also how we build them. Peter, I wanted to bring you in at this point. And there was a quote that I took from your wonderful interview with Babuk Sayed in Archer. That you were saying that working in the Aboriginal community requires time and a lot of trust. If the Aboriginal health services aren't working for us Aboriginal LGBT people, then we need queer spaces to be serving us better. When a lot of the organisations trying to help Aboriginal people and queer mob have a history of failing these communities, it's hard to rebuild that trust. The issue of trust and the issue of trying to find space, particularly within the sector of healthcare, and I know we've brought it up a lot. And it's okay I think it's okay to sort of talk about a building that doesn't work. And if the architect's kind of going to get offended by that, then I kind of think it's they need to take it on. So, yeah, Peter.
Okay, I just want to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Kulin Nation myself, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also want to pay my respects to the LGBTIQ brother, boy, sister, girl community that have come before me and helped me be able to say what I need to say, and I want to pay my respects to other Aboriginal people in the room. I guess I just want to start at the bio, because I'm a cisgendered queer person, and I've changed that recently. I think sometimes in the Aboriginal community, and I'm not bagging the community, you've got to be really careful as an Aboriginal person. Enough people bag the Aboriginal community. So we need to critique ourselves as well, but we need spaces where we can critique ourselves. And I guess that's the same. So I try to be a good ally, and recently I've changed that bio again to say I'm an Arigo person. Often we refer ourselves, we have a strong history of men's business and women's business. And for gender diverse and trans mob, we have to open up spaces. And I feel like as an ally, I need to be proactively doing that as well, and questioning the community. And I guess I do that mostly in my art, but also in my experiences. I'm not a trans person, but I feel like I'm a trans ally, and I want the best for the whole rainbow community. So I feel that we need to understand it, and by talking, listening actually, and understanding. And I think everyone has to do that. And we as a community, I work in a bubble, I work in a queer space, Thorne Harbour Health, and I work in this queer space. That doesn't always ripple out to the Aboriginal community, and the space is there, and the dialogue needs to happen. So part of my role in work is we'll be running some more inclusive training and getting the word out there. There's not one Aboriginal org that has a rainbow tick yet. So, but then I'm not sure Thorne Harbour Health has a rainbow tick either. So, which is a bit naughty. We might be working, but there is a project now that will hopefully see the first Aboriginal organisation get a rainbow tick. I think it's just a personal. I grew up in a white family. That's the double barrel name, the Waples. I had to deal with my queerness and gayness first, which was very hard in the AIDS era, really highly homophobic, and we lived under the threat of being bashed to death, actually, most of the time. So growing up as a young person, they're the things that I had to think about, my safety all the bloody time. People were being pushed off cliffs, murdered. Where I lived, it wasn't a safe time. And so I internalised a lot of that stuff, which can happen. We internalise our phobias. And then I had to take that, as I worked that, I had to take my queerness into the Aboriginal community, and it was not an easy journey. I got told I wasn't a real man, and I could think about the role of queer people in the community and how that is gendered as well, you know. We're not seen as real Aboriginal people. There's narratives of us whether we came with colonisation. That's a really hard one to have to live with, that we're some sort of another form of disease or something that came with colonisation, that our erasure from our colonial times, we don't know the stories, but who wrote our history? We didn't get to write it, you know. That was written by Christian and other religious groups, missionaries, who would have viewed us as quite abhorrent if that was happening. So we have a big erasure. We want it back. We feel culturally isolated as queer people, and we want our connection to culture because, you know, as an Aboriginal person, that's the key to what I am as well. That's sort of... that's the intersection space, you know. So we've got a round table in a couple of weeks, which is great, and we had a camp last year. I think there's work to do, and that's the role of an ally, and now I'm getting called uncle or auntie, or someone calls me ankle, combination of uncle and auntie, which I really love in the queer community, so I'm taking it on.
Ankle's
and just questioning that whole role of gender and making it, just getting the community to think about how binaries... I just think the architecture needs to make everyone question binaries, and how it does that is up to the architects. But there should be things that make you confused or feel the way and give you empathy towards other people that maybe confuse your gender role. So that's what I try to do in a visual art sense, by promoting some of the terms we use and pronouns that the community aren't across yet, that we've got to recognise as a queer community that we've taken that a lot further than some of the other parts of the community as well. So I think I'll just stop there. Sorry.
What? Yeah, Andrew, yeah.
I got two thoughts from what you've said. You've made me remember two things in life. One was a cartoon that I saw, because you've said this is more than bathrooms, but there was a cartoon I saw in the paper once that had the signs for the toilets, and both the pictures of the people were in skirts because we were in Scotland.
Oh, of course.
And there's this old couple standing outside, utterly confused, like, which one do we go in? So I don't know what. I think your art and confusing bringing people forward that brought that into mind. But the other one was, I had a partner when I first transitioned who is a gay male, and we went to Circuit Bar. If anybody knows it, the male-only space.
Yes, I've been to Circuit.
Pardon?
I got into Circuit.
Oh, very good. Well, it depends on what night of the week, doesn't it? But anyway, now, him being a gay male, knew lots of other people there, and the hubbub of the music and the lights, and it's all dark and everything, and we were going to go, and I was walking out, and I didn't realise he was saying goodbye to people behind me, so I ended out on the street before him. So I thought, that's all right, I'll just stand here for a minute. So I was standing outside watching for 15 minutes while people left. And this is just like four years ago, or whenever it opened, not long ago. Every single guy who left looked both ways up and down the street before they come out the doors and then walked on. I wanted time-lapse photography, like, you know, an opening flower or something, just so that people could see every single face doing it, that it's still not over. And what's the point is that that's who we are. That's us. So where is our safe zone? What does that look like? And then how do we move through the spaces in the world that aren't for us? So.
I got married in a kilt because I thought it was the only dress that my family would let me get away with getting married in. But anyway,
That's hot though.
it looked great.
Yeah.
I wore a kilt and motorcycle boots. Next time we go to a party, I'll wear it for you. It looks good. It's good. I need to, you know, reclaim the memory. SJ, we had a wonderful interaction on the Facebook. On the Facebooks, and this is where all moments of, you know, of genius happen when you're just in a shit post. And so I did a shit post, and the shit post was about the conversation around women and girls asterisk non-binary, and I have this sort of thing that's just. It's a bit of a strange caveat, and yeah, it's usually this thing that that kind of cis authors or cis people will kind of say. So this was your response. Orgs make what is all too common mistake of sweeping non-binary people into the unreserved category of womanhood. This is fucked in several ways, all of which boil down to an undermining of the self-identification of a group of people who share a specifically gendered experience and embodiment, which is its own autonomous thing and not a subcategory of one or other binary gender. People do this all the time. They do it to me every day without any notion of what persistent and pervasive form of violent erasure it constitutes. And I loved it. It was a good quote. So I thought I'll project it in very large font and get you to kind of speak to it, because they're your words.
Is this on? Yeah. No.
Is this on?
Is it on?
Yeah.
It's just very weird.
It's a bit quiet.
Oh, that's very weird. Before I start, I'm also going to just acknowledge that we're on unceded Kulin land and pay my respects to the old people of this country, to the communities that sustain it, and to any mob who are here tonight, especially also to my queer and Aboriginal elders sitting on this panel. Yeah, so I'm also a legendary Facebook shit poster. I do some of my best thinking and writing on Facebook, especially around a lot of things actually, but I think a great deal of my sort of process of how to put it. My process of making myself visible in the world as a non-binary person has largely happened on Facebook, and I think a lot of millennial trans people can have possibly like similar experiences.
Giving it a good go.
You're giving it a good go. You do great. I mean, this was an offshoot of your you were the OP on this one, so you know.
This is about you.
Yeah. So what was I? This is a bugbear of mine too. Obviously, bugbear is kind of an understatement. You know, I don't want to be anybody's asterisk. Like nobody wants to be anybody's asterisk, and I think it's something that sort of, in my experience, navigating the world as an artist and as an AFAB person in particular, you know, it's something that happens kind of almost constantly in one way or another. And it's just like another way that the world kind of consistently tells me that they don't take me seriously, or that they don't think that the gendered space that I occupy is a real thing. And I think every trans person I know has experienced some form of that pretty consistently, especially, you know, at different points. It's not like, you know, a transition or like, I mean, it's a very imperfect framework to talk about our lives or how we live them, or the trajectory that we all move within our very specific journeys with ourselves and with our gender. But, you know, I think specifically if you're choosing not to or cannot go down what a cis-centric gaze regards to be a traditional or correct path of gender transition, or if you're a non-binary person, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was just sort of, I think I was just pissed off that day about that. I'm pissed off most days about that. And I think there's not a day of my life where it doesn't affect me in some way or another. Especially sort of navigating the world as I currently do as someone who is pretty cis-passing. I feel like when I'm in when I'm in majority queer space, people are able to, my gender is legible to people for the most part. I'll just adjust that actually. When I'm in majority trans space, my gender is legible to people. When I'm in majority queer space, it's not necessarily. When I'm out in the world, people read me generally as a woman. But the difference is I'm an artist with a public life, and I've been very public about who I am, how I identify, what my gender is, what my pronouns are. And when you've been sort of very public and very explicit about that as a person who has a public life and a public output as an artist, it's really fucked to have to keep saying that to people and have to keep saying it in public over and over and over and over and over again. And I think for me, I'm sorry I'm rambling a little bit now, but for me, I think particularly, you know, if you're a woman artist, people have a really big investment in you remaining a woman artist, you know. You know what I mean? Like they never let you be anything else, you know, because I'm apparently supposed to remain in this space to shore up the numbers of women artists, you know, and it's really shit. And you sort of, there's an undercurrent of being treated almost like a traitor if you leave that cohort, or you're being perceived to leave that cohort. It's like, I was never in that cohort. I'm just being clear about it now.
Yeah.
You know, I figured out when I was about 11 that I wasn't really this thing called a woman, or that I didn't occupy that category in the way that I was expected to. And, you know, and I had a palpably different sense of my embodiment. But, yeah, so you sort of get pushed into navigating the world in a specific way, and I think, what was it that I was trying to say? I've lost my train of thought. Even just in terms of like you know, this is something that happened within the sort of information architecture of Facebook and the internet, you know, and like I have to be really like kind of a bit. I don't think about architecture that much. To be honest, I don't. Even though I'm like an installation artist, like, you know.
But you think about a lot. You think about the body a lot.
I think about the body, and I think
as an
about
eventing
space.
space.
Exactly.
Is
no, totally.
Yeah.
And I sort of come from, like, to an extent, a choreographic background as well. So I think about the way that bodies move through space and that kind of. So maybe I do think about architecture. I don't know, but I think about it in different ways or through different critical frameworks or with different languages.
Yeah.
But in terms of the way that I navigate the art world, for instance, you know, like I just got, I was in a dialogue, for instance, with like a major public institution on Instagram, actually. We were Instagram messaging each other very recently about a call out that was directed at female identifying artists, you know. And the specific criteria of this call out for this major fellowship was, you know, it was for female identifying artists. And there was, I wrote to them and I was like, can you explain to me what you mean by that? Like, can you please define that for me? Because you need to give me a clear definition of what that means. And we sort of got into a dialogue and whatever, and it sort of got to the inevitable point where they were sort of like, oh, but of course we're inclusive of non-binary people. I'm like, not if it's a female identifying artist, you're fucking not.
Yeah.
Like you are explicitly excluding that group, you know. And it's really, really boring to have to keep having that conversation like every day in my working life. The end.
Yeah, and I guess the thing that's annoying is I read a lot of articles that talk about, for instance, you know, street violence, and it'll be violence against women and girls, and what annoys me is like, well, okay, what about non-binary people? Because non-binary people aren't girls.
Yeah. Stories about street violence.
You know, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. You know, like, yeah, totally. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's your...
I'm not really going to tell
I'm
you
just a
stories about
moderator.
street violence.
Oh,
That's
you're not,
gonna
are you?
That's not going to be pleasant for
Okay.
anybody here, I don't think. But we can say that I've copped a fair bit of it in my life, to the extent where it's actually been significantly impacted on my ability to like leave the house on a daily basis. And, you know, I have experienced sexual assault, you know, and a lot of gendered violence, like a lot of gendered violence in public space. Dudes chasing me, dudes punching me, dudes spitting on me or spitting on my partner, you know, like more harassment than I could ever possibly have recorded or remembered in my life, you know. And I've experienced that as someone who's been like moved through the world as a high femme. I've experienced that as someone who's moved through the world who reads very butch. I've experienced that as someone who is also, you know, fair skinned and white passing, but can like variously be clocked as more racialized depending on how I'm wearing my hair. Is it straightened? Am I wearing makeup? Etc. 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 So I feel like I kind of moved through a lot of different calibrations in terms of my presentation, and there's not one single space where I receive less harassment on the street or like less. I just receive different versions, or it just has different flavors, basically. But you know, so many of the discussions that were happening and so necessary and so excellent about all of this stuff last year just were kind of like eviscerating to take part in a lot of the time as a non-binary trans person, because it was just like you're consistently erasing my experience of violence. Like every time you talk about women and girls, I'm like, yes, and like, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean also like one of the capacity for lateral violence is just something that's not spoken about, and it's always this idea that violence is so binary. It's you know it's men against women,
or that women and girls can't also be perpetrators of violence.
Well,
like not, you know. But
like this capacity for violence that, you know, if we look at like the histories of like trans exclusionary radical feminism, for instance, you know, like there's some really serious, you know, systemic violence that's happening in that. So, yeah.
This is a systematic problem, and the opportunity that architecture has is what Peter was talking about, to break down those stereotypes for us. Because if you have men and women and feminine things and masculine things and you don't mix or challenge them, then the society itself, there is, I relate to so much of what you said, because there is a requirement that you keep your feminineness to shore up the numbers of women in work or things like that. And I have actually been told I'm not appropriate for certain spaces because of the gender numbers they're trying to get. And I'm thinking, I've got a female birth certificate. You know, does that pass? You know, what do you need for your numbers? You know, so it's everywhere you go, it's binary, like just going to the toilet. So back to the loos. It's just walking into the space is asking you to choose a gender. And let's have some fun with it. Can we try and create ways that flip that and challenge people who have a gender to say, exactly like that cartoon did, which way do I go? That would be awesome fun.
Well, when I was putting the stickers on the bathrooms outside, whilst there was about 200 students walking out of a lecture, I think there were some people that weren't quite sure about what door they were about to walk into, and I was like, okay, cool. Bianca, oh, sorry, yeah, Sally.
I think that, yeah, adding some fun into it is a good thing. And just, it's not so much a space story, but just how limiting gender is. About a year ago, a friend of mine who's a trans man, and his partner who is non-binary, and myself as a trans woman, and just checking, anyone not aware of the term cisgender, cis being Latin for on the same side as, so someone who's assigned female at birth, happy being female. We were off to, the trans man was in a series of docos on LGBTIQ people in Melbourne. And it was a bit of a glammy evening event, so we're a bit glammed up, and someone said, what about makeup? Do you think any of the four of us, despite all our backgrounds, knew how to do makeup? None of us, regardless of gender. So sometimes, yes, have a laugh at gender and have a think about it and think how limiting it is, and just let's design a space that works. And thinking on the flip side of what Andrew was saying about Peter Mac, a few of us in the trans community, more so, I think from memory, trans women went to the Rose Clinic at David Jones on breast cancer. And we're thinking anyone, anybody, any gender identity can get breast cancer. This is, there's going to be another one. So how do we break down those things that we just have assumed about gender? Sometimes they're just so deeply ingrained. I've made mistakes before, that of all the days to do it, Trans Day of Visibility, I was giving a talk, and I will say now, a person with very long pink hair, a flowing green gothic dress, got up, asked me a question, a couple of sentences later I referred to as she. We've got this ingrained in us, so I suppose we've just got to keep watching for it, keep looking out for, oh, is that really true, or is it just another gendered assumption, and break it and make it, what is the aim of the space we're trying to, that we want? Go back to the basics. Well, we want, as Andrew said, say for Peter Mac, a hospital that's, welcoming and comforting to everyone, let's say. Or for me doing swimming, can I just, find a place where I can do it enjoyably? How do we cater for more inclusivity? So it's just, I suppose, again, it comes back to have a bit of fun and keep questioning the question with the fun in mind.
Yeah, but I think the outcomes, there's an opportunity for the way that we design spaces that can be part of education, that can be part of like a transformative process, and I think that's the opportunity that it brings along. Bianca, this is a quote from your fabulous book, Reclaiming the Nighttime Economy. Unwanted sexual attention in pubs and clubs. Spaces are rarely being produced in a singular, uniform way. There are usually others present who are producing their own relational spaces, or who experience the same space in very different ways, from a different socio-cultural locus, subverting the dominant gender, sexual, racial norms, and contesting the power relations of that space. Do you want to have a bit of a chat about that and how it relates to architecture and governance, perhaps?
Sure, I will try. Hopefully I will be vaguely coherent in what I say.
Oh, I reckon you're going to give it a good hard crack.
So just following on from Sally, I'm sadly going to take all of the fun out of the conversation right now as someone who, as Simona said at the start, researches sexual violence. So I'm particularly concerned in my work in looking at some of the ways, I guess, in which space, our sense of belonging and place within a space and our identity shapes experiences of violence, and also the potential for violence to occur. So I guess I'm looking at this issue from a very particular lens or angle. The other thing I just wanted to say from the outset that I think is important to acknowledge as well is that I'm the token cis het person on the panel. So I just wanted to be really clear that I'm speaking from a research perspective. I can speak to some of the issues that have come up in my own research and in academic literature, but I'm not here
Can I interrupt? Can I say it? But you're an ally.
I am an ally, yes.
And I think,
yes.
but I think allyship is actually really important. So I would take away the token and say that you're very much an important part of this panel. Continue.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, acknowledge that I'm not speaking from personal experience. So I guess part of the reason that I chose this quote is that I'm particularly interested in, I think, the absence of discussion in space in a lot of our research on sexual violence in particular. There's almost this assumption that space is just this inert backdrop that life happens on. We don't often talk about it as being productive or talk about how the material and built environment might relate and shape the production of our identities, the way in which we experience a space, how we relate to other people in that space. And I know that the event is called Beyond Bathrooms, but I wanted to use bathrooms as an example because I think they're a really good one. But they also came up in some of my research from this book, which was looking at sexual violence in the nighttime economy. So I think for me, the bathroom really, and I'm talking, about the kind of heteronormatively gendered bathroom spaces that we see so the kind of male and female bathrooms that we see in, most of the licensed venues that I went to. So I think that they're quite a striking example, firstly, of how spaces are designed and imbued with particular gendered power relations. So it's not this natural organisation of space. The gendered bathroom is designed around particular assumptions about how the world is organised and structured. It's designed around particular assumptions about the nature of people's bodies and their gender identities, but it also actively reinforces and reproduces those power relations. And I think those spaces are also tied up in how we experience and perform our gender, right? So, I think for cis het people, I'm reaffirmed that I'm a cis het woman every time I walk into the bathroom, right? Like I know how to navigate my body through that space. I know that I belong in that particular space. So it's tied up in the performance of our gender, and how we're able to do that is it's structured through the spaces that we have available to us. And it's also relational, right? So I know that I belong because I'm in this space with other women or other people who I think have a body that's similar to mine, and they're doing a gender in a way that conforms to these particular limited norms. And I think, firstly, for trans people in my research, that kind of bathroom design, most obviously was encountered as a form of violence and exclusion from particular spaces. It was also something that was those power relations were actively reinforced by other people within those venues. So this idea that anyone who was read as being out of place in a particular space that was deemed to be for a particular, gender and sex identity, that was often responded to with violence. And I think that actually exposes the artificial nature of those spaces, right? And actually exposes the way that there's nothing natural about this design and layout of space, that actually it's imbued with a whole range of assumptions about our bodies and the world. But the other thing, and I think what the second half of my quote hopefully illustrates, is that trans people and anyone who doesn't fit really into that cis het not binary, but cis het understanding of how our bodies should be, they're also disrupting and challenging those spaces and exposing them for what they are. And I think that opens up potential for doing things differently. So that makes some sense.
No, for sure.
But I use bathrooms because I think it's a really striking and clear example, but spaces within venues, and I also look at public spaces a lot, they're produced in those kind of gendered ways in a whole range of different ways. So if mainstream kind of nightclubs that were predominantly for a kind of, cis heterosexual market. If you've ever been into one of those and looked at the dance floor and had a look at the organisation of bodies in those spaces, right? Like that space is being produced in a very particular gendered heteronormative way, right?
I haven't been to a hetero club in a while, but next time I go,
I don't recommend it.
Yeah.
On that point,
Yeah, no, go for it. Yeah.
I probably don't need them.
Give it a
It's
go.
interesting that the three examples that we've talked about are hospitals, bathrooms, and nightclubs. Because these are three spaces which are very explicitly about the body, and are spaces where the body is either being disciplined or the opposite is the trajectory. Do you know what I mean? In the case of the nightclub. And it's interesting, hey, because I sort of live and dwell and spend a lot of my life in nightclubs, but specifically in the techno scene, and as do you, Simona. So I'm sure we'll yarn about this more later. And I think this came up on your Instagram the other day briefly as well. But I was in a club on the weekend with my partner where I find myself in Melbourne at least, like sort of shifting between nominally straight clubs not nominally straight clubs, cis-het dominated spaces and queer spaces. I have to go into those cis-het dominated spaces against my desire to do so, because that's often where the good music is. Like if I want to go see a really big international DJ, then I have to go to a straight club, unfortunately, if I'm in this town. And it's kind of often quite horrific and requires like there's a very specific way that I feel like I need to navigate those spaces as a non-binary person. But the bathrooms thing is really interesting. And I'm just going to cycle back to what I was saying before I got myself off track. But I was at a club on the weekend, which is not a designated queer space. It's not a designated queer, it's just a techno party. It's been running for a long time. And they have recently rewritten their club's policies to be specifically queer and trans embracing. And that was the policies that they rewrote were really, really totally fucking excellent. But they also did stuff like they rewrote the policies around like their tolerance for people having phones on the dance floor. They rewrote their policies around like how they expect people to move through the dance floor. Like all this kind of stuff, like all the different ways where if you're a club promoter and you're making a Dionysiac space, you have to put like a lot of thought and intentionality into how you choreograph the movement of bodies through that space. And if you're going to be making your club more trans and gender inclusive, then that is a huge, it's like, that's a huge other kind of literacy that these like two straight cis-het bro club promoters have to learn, and they kind of did a sort of semi-amazing job, but they were still stuck on the bathroom thing. Which is really annoying, because the thing is like, I genuinely think that doing something as simple and as basic as desegregating in the bathrooms in a club space actually changes the entire vibe of the club space. And like I'm talking about clubs because I think clubs are like a really interesting microcosm for gendered politics and how they play out in the public realm in general. Like they're just super fascinating little petri dishes of human behaviour. And
Petri dishes.
like,
Oof.
and it's just really, you desegregate the bathrooms, you let people piss where they want. It actually changes the way people behave, like quite profoundly and noticeably, you know.
Yeah, well, even like festivals as well.
Yeah.
I think like the most friendly or the easiest place for toilets that I've ever seen at a festival was 50 thunderboxes lined up against the Maribyrnong River at Laneway Festival, and everyone was just kind of like waiting to go to their individual stall to go to the toilet.
Yeah.
And it's the same at Meredith.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, well, that actually works.
Yeah,
you can
it
wait
works.
in the open air.
It's not a fucking drama. Like, it's really not a drama.
And no one cared. And this was
know?
this was like the early 2000s, even before these conversations came about. But we were supposed to have Bexx Davis from Listen and Minus 18. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to come tonight, but one of the things I did want to raise was how important the work of Listen and Minus 18 in terms of the way that they manage events. Is really important, and the type of work and the type of education it needs to come across to educate not only the people that attend the parties but also its performers, its staff. And it comes into...
People, ladies. Sorry to interrupt.
Ladies.
Hi, ladies.
Ladies.
Welcome, ladies.
Stop doing that.
True, absolutely. So it's like some of the work I think that these organisations have done and that clubs are doing, music venues as well, where we've been trying to make these spaces really inclusive at a very grassroots level, actually have very significant contributions to make to professional practice, but also to building management. And we also, we build these spaces, and then how do we manage when there is things like, disputes, when someone rocks up and goes, well, hang on, I don't like that, or they rip down a sign or whatever, and there needs to be some kind of, strategy that the building managers have to have, and it needs to be also from the briefing process. So the idea of having, I guess, us as stakeholders on the stage is about, well, even before you sort of write the briefs, it's also about the earlier that you can have conversations about this, then the easier it is to design this into your buildings and manage your spaces that way. So, yeah.
There's a bar opposite the West Garth Cinema, and it's got purple outside if you want to go there. There's 3 toilets there. There's a men's and there's a ladies, and there's one in the middle. It's just the one in the middle. It doesn't have any signs on it at all. And I was thinking about what you said about that makes people behave a certain way. It's not only that they've done there. The bar's curved, and the seats are around tables in little bits of area. And some of them have couches and some of them don't. And then there are board games and things like that. And I was just thinking, as you were talking about the physical space makes people behave in a certain way. We are not all the same. Even trans and gender diverse people are not all the same. And then there's a cultural side to it, and there's different cultures, and everyone's going out into public spaces, and they all want to feel safe and at home in the public spaces, and they're all different. And some women do want to be called ladies and go to a ladies, and some men want to sit there like blokes and carry on or what have you. So the physical spaces we make have to make room for everyone. So, and I suppose that's what works so well in that space, that it's not zoned as such, but there are zones that you can make this corner your own for your group, and yet that statement that there is this toilet in the middle that has no name at all says something from the establishment's point of view, I suppose, that says everyone's welcome here.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it says something about the culture of the client, it says something about the culture of the design, but also about the community as well. So, I think architecture has this, and design, and has this really important role to play in leading that change.
And it does not have a rainbow flag on the door, and it is the most inclusive place I've ever been in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's lots of ways to communicate, and something that was just as Andrew was talking, I had the pleasure of visiting the office of a Canberra-based transgender diverse intersex organisation, Agenda, in about 2012. Trans premises, which was, still something we need more of for communities. And it was just the posters on the wall and all those little things that made me feel so good. And now Transgender Victoria's little home in Carlton, with, as we call it, World Benign Gender Headquarters or something. But I know we're talking physical and tangible. I know I tend to be abstract, but it's just those things that get created where I think it does come down, and I suppose what got me thinking here was SJ's comments about who's leading it. And I think that's so critical, because the space that we're at Drummond Street, it just possibly, I don't know, this couldn't have happened anywhere else. 2 things in about 3 days. Went into the all-gender bathrooms, but there was someone who society, in my guess, would have probably assumed had a male identity, just calmly applying eyeliner as if nothing happened. So it's about who's leading it. And if people are limited, I suppose they're not going to be able to do that. And then 2 days later, I was trying to get a meeting, a quick meeting with the CEO of Drummond Street, bumped into the executive assistant. Oh, look, CEO not available for a couple of hours, tied up, and I just couldn't resist and said, as long as it's safe and consensual. So it is about creating an atmosphere as well as the physical. And I think that I'm a great believer, as someone who's thinks about organisational management, it's about spreading those values, and that's what sort of clicked in as I was listening to SJ. Yeah, those people were probably trying their best, but they're possibly also stuck by their own limitations on how to make that space feel safe. And one of the most energised spaces, I've just got to say, I had a bit of fun a couple of years ago. I had the honour of being in a film clip for a song that Yana Alana was doing, the fabulous performer, sometimes allegedly known as Sarah Ward. And it was a cover of Peach's I, You, She Together. And I've got to say, just the whole energy in a nice, respectful, positive, genuinely endorsing way was just so bloody hot, because it was almost beyond gender. And you can feel these things. So how do we capture that feel, I suppose, is what I'm trying to blab out in my rambly sort of way. How do we capture it more? How can we then turn the abstract idea into that tangible? I'll leave it with that thought.
No, I guess it's the same. I go to the Aboriginal space in Fitzroy and use that service because the floor is beautiful. It's really welcoming, and and I go there for cultural connections, So I need to do that as well as an Aboriginal person. So then I get my fix of queer stuff in other spaces. So sometimes I'd like those 2 spaces to combine somehow.
Same.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty hard how. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's all right.
I'm just emphatically agreeing, because it's like I feel like those, those are not separate parts of my identity. They're like completely enmeshed, but for other people, they're like somehow they're never allowed to be in the same room, and that's a real struggle for queer mob still.
Sometimes we gloss it over with. No, we just gloss it over with. We've seen a much more. We've had black divas. There's lots of black drag queens. There seems to be more visibility of us. And at marches, we're finally getting to lead queer marches. In Sydney and here in Pride Centre. But there's just something. Like those 2 identities are so separate that you can't bring them together. We need spaces that do that.
Yeah, Bianca.
Just 2 things really quickly. Firstly, if you haven't seen that video clip that Sally was just talking about, you have to Google it as soon as you get out of here because it's amazing. Just going back to, I guess, that production of safe spaces, and particularly within venues. And I totally agree with everything that you said, Andrew. But I guess just the other thing I would add, at least based on some of the people I spoke to in my research, was that it can also depend so much on the particular venue and the location that it's in, right? So those spaces, like Northcote was explicitly mentioned as an area where it's like I can, pretty safely assume I can go into any venue like along High Street, and or most venues, not all of them, but and I can probably assume that it's going to be queer friendly, and if there is anyone there who's, engaging in inappropriate behaviour or harassing me or whatever, I know I can go to the bar staff and they're going to take that seriously, and they're probably going to kick that person out. again, maybe making some assumptions about the area, but generally speaking, you know, people felt safer and more confident, I guess, in venues in that area. Whereas if it was, say, like the inner city where it wasn't, you know, it wasn't a kind of queer enclave like Northcote and Fitzroy and some of those inner city suburbs can be, although not always. And there was more ambiguity, I guess, around the space, and it was more of an unknown as to whether, you know, are the bar staff going to have my back if I need to go and say something, or whatever, that having those kind of really visible signifiers could be particularly important in those spaces. So having like the rainbow flag, and I know not everyone identifies with that, but that kind of, you know, visible signal that says, this space is going to be, or should be okay for you, and you can say something to us here. This is a safe space for queer people. That could be really powerful. And I think also in just setting the tone for that space as well, right? Like not just for queer people that were going in there, but even more so for cis-het people to say, you know, this is not a space where you can engage in harassment and violence and we're just going to turn the other way and not do anything.
Yeah. And you hope that it would kind of follow through. I guess like the issue has been that like that sticker's been used for a corporate reason. Whereas like, you know, particularly in the City of London, there's actually a charter that venues can sign up to. So, you know, I'm interested in how City of Melbourne, for instance, or other cities might actually create that charter as well, so that the venues can really commit to these spaces becoming not only a place of belonging, but there's some sense of permanence. Like we don't want to lose our space in the middle of the city, for instance. Like we're losing our clubs every week. So, yeah, the idea that if we're kind of like pushed out through gentrification, and gentrification is a huge issue for queer and trans people. Like, you know, we can kind of spend 5-6 years in our community and where we're living, and then all of a sudden the real estate goes up and we're sort of forced out into finding a whole new different neighbourhood, and all of a sudden just going to the supermarket is a huge risk. So, yeah. At this point, I just wanted to open up to the floor for some questions. Is there anyone? Grace is up the back there. Hi, Grace. How are you? Yeah. I've got one over here.
Hi, I've given up going to queer clubs or LGBTI clubs because I don't really feel safe in them usually. I often feel much safer in straight clubs, and I go to a couple of them quite a lot. So I go to Cherry Bar quite a lot and the Nightcat. And I know the history of the Cherry Bar story in relation to degendering the bathroom. There was a gender diverse, I guess, non-binary type act that came on, I don't know what, and they asked James Young specifically to degender the bathrooms or they wouldn't appear, so he complied and he gendered the bathrooms. And he said everything was fine, and so, but he put up on the Facebook page for Cherry Bar, what does the Cherry patrons think? Should the bathrooms be gendered? And overwhelmingly, women just posted and said, no, we want our own little space. And they use, I mean, I'm in there quite a lot, and they use it as it's a place to retreat from the male kind of world. And so James just retreated. It was an overwhelming thing. And he said, okay, you know, we'll make sure that the accessible toilet is labelled clearly that it's welcoming of all genders, and actually says welcoming all genders, or did for a while anyway, I'm not sure now. And, you know, so that was one experience. The other was the Nightcat, and I'm not sure of the history of it, but the Nightcat at one stage had, you know, toilets with urinals, toilets without urinals, and degendered the space for a while. But they've actually gone back and regendered it very recently. And I'm just, you know, I just think that in the straight world, women are really seeking that separate space. That's the impression I get. I just wondered if the panel comment.
It just makes me so sad, though. Do you know what I mean? Like, it makes me so sad.
It makes me sad for the hets. I'm like, wow, how fucked is your world? that women have to hide in the toilets to like have space to themselves, you know? Yeah, I don't have a whole lot else to say to that other than that. It makes me really sad. And I think that, I don't know, this is one of those moments where I'm just like, y'all got a lot to learn from the queers. Like,
Yeah.
you know, like I've got knowledge to share with the world about how to be, you know, I don't know, happy or, you know, like I don't know what. Yeah, anyway.
Happy.
Yeah.
You must talk
Maybe
to me afterwards.
That's not actually true, but you know what I mean. Just like sometimes when I'm in a lot of straight spaces, straight nightclub spaces in particular, I'm just like, my partner and I will be on the dance floor so often just going like, are their heads okay? Like, they're not okay. They're so, like, they're suffering, man. Like, we need to help them with their stuff. And when I'm sort of half joking, but we do.
We do.
Anyway.
I tend to think that
smarter and more serious to say than that.
I tend to think that the people that do come on board, for instance, like, you know, like some of the techno clubs, I think it does really kind of permeate through. It frees them up.
Yes, I'm just back to talk about sexual violence again. Sorry. So I guess that's something that came up a lot in some of my research in venues as well, and particularly this idea that having gendered bathrooms gave cishet women a space that they could escape to, particularly if they were being harassed by men in clubs. I think that was not the only reason, but part of the reason that they were really strongly valued. There was kind of this idea that they're almost a kind of protective space. At the same time, I think I think it's problematic for a whole range of reasons, but primarily like from a sexual violence kind of prevention and escape kind of perspective. Well, I also spoke to a lot of people who were sexually assaulted in toilets. So this idea that having, you know, gendered signs on the doors will somehow magically, like there's some magic force field that will keep someone who's going to perpetrate sexual violence out is very problematic. Obviously, it's also assuming that sexual violence is happening within that, you know, cis man as perpetrator, cis woman as victim kind of paradigm as well. So I've forgotten where I was going with that. Other than that, I think we can really challenge the idea that you know, having this kind of gendered woman-only space is going to somehow keep women safe. I think it's false hope essentially.
Yeah, and I think that it's. I agree in the word with the word sad that there's an assumption that violence is going to happen, and unfortunately it does. But somehow we've got to start getting to a higher place on that. And I do remember something in a training session once that I did with TGV, and I've got a funny feeling, Andrew, you might have been there doing this one with me, but we'll give it a shot, where a woman said, you know, heaven forbid I was being assaulted. I just hope that if I screamed, someone would come to me regardless of gender. Yeah. And so as I totally agree that having a sign on the door isn't going to stop some, horrible act happening if someone's setting out to do that. So I think, yes, space is important. Let's also look about digging up some, dysfunctional assumptions that we have to expect violence, and, continuing to talk respect has got to be helpful on that regard.
Yeah, Andrew, yeah.
One comment?
If ladies are using the bathroom to remain safe, that implies that in the physical architecture, there's no other safe space. One way, if you want to degender your bathrooms, then create a safe space that isn't a bathroom.
Yeah.
It's like a no-brainer, but it's not done because everyone assumes that women will just run to the bathroom.
Yeah, it's this idea that we need to rethink our retreat spaces. And we need to reconfigure them. We need to reimagine what are they supposed to provide. But we also need to understand, the idea of gender neutrality is probably only going to give rise to the same systems of inequality that are going to come. I know someone who was this guy who's probably a bit of an MRA and was like, oh, I really like the gender neutral bathrooms. I went in there and just had a look and, and took up some space. And it was like, yeah, great, you're just not getting it, are you? But that's actually an outcome that can happen. So it's this idea that we need to recognise that we need to provide a variety of spaces. We need to think about not only gender non-conforming people, but we also need to think about religious groups, we need to think about people of different abilities, we need to think of all of these intersections and redesign the bathroom.
We haven't got there. The world's pretty unsafe.
Well, there's no post... Yeah.
It's really unsafe for so many people. Yeah. It's just an unsafe place until we change attitudes and change the way people think, or from early times, and how people are socialised.
Yeah, and policing bodies doesn't make it safer. You know what I mean?
Yeah. How do you make a safe space when there's, we know that spaces aren't safe?
It doesn't matter whether it's toilets or policing the way that, feminine presenting people dress, for instance. Like, either way, it's putting the onus on the body and the person inhabiting that body and how that body occupies space rather than the spaces that it's occupying and the society that it's occupying.
Yeah. Bianca,
So I was going to say, I think a couple of things, just going back to the idea that the gendered bathroom is a space of retreat. I think my other issue with that is that it reinforces the idea that sexual violence is an inevitable reality in women's lives everyone's lives, rather than actually seeking to challenge and prevent that violence. So I think it, in some respects, might stop us from doing some of that the transformative work that we actually need to happen. And I think the other thing I just wanted to go back to was the extent of violence that the trans and gender diverse people in my studies experienced in the bathrooms. So those gendered bathrooms were enabling and normalising violence against people who don't conform to that cisgendered reality. Cisgendered. You know what I'm saying? I've lost words, but you know what I mean. Something that I think has really frustrated me about the toilet debate, and again, I know we're trying to get beyond that debate, but is that it's almost playing off sexual violence that cis-het women experience against the violence that trans and gender diverse people experience in toilets. Can we not imagine a world where neither of those things are possibilities anymore?
Yeah, and I think at times it kind of invents a furphy when it's not actually dealing with something that's actually happening, and it's like, why would you do that to, stall the argument? Bathroom stall. It's not my joke. It's actually, there's this thing called Stalled by an architect in the States with Susan Stryker. It's a program called Stalled, which is about reimagining the bathroom space or the retreat space. So anyway, check it out.